This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 243 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast, and it's the first in a new series of deep dives when I interview some people who I've come to know over the years and who I know have so much to say about thoughtful travel that I really want to spend an entire episode chatting with them. So I'm planning to do these deep dives into thoughtful travel about once a month or so, and my very first one today is with JoAnna Haugen. So it's episode 243, JoAnna Haugen, a deep dive into thoughtful travel. There is no scuba tank attached to us, but I think we'll survive. So I first connected with JoAnna early 2020, and I followed her work closely ever since because she says a lot of smart things. So let me introduce a little about JoAnna before we get chatting. She's the founder of Rooted Storytelling, which is a business she describes as a solutions platform at the intersection of sustainable tourism, storytelling, and social impact. So essentially her work is to help travel and tourism businesses be thoughtful, and that's why I love her. Now JoAnna has had a really interesting career and lived in lots of interesting places. So in fact, when we spoke for this interview, she was actually in Ukraine, and before long she'll be in Tunisia. So some really, really cool places. Her career actually started out of college with a stint in the US Peace Corps in Kenya back in 2004. Since then, she's worked in various communications roles, mostly in travel and tourism. She was a regular, normal consumer-focused travel writer for many years, and then she founded Rooted in 2019. So that's just a bit of background. And I'm going to start and get on to the interview in just a second, but I want to warn you, I'm going to interrupt it a couple of times because while I was editing, I just thought of some more stuff I wanted to mention. So excuse me in advance for butting in. But let's get started. Can you tell me what the concept of thoughtful travel means to you? Like, how do you define it?
Well, I think that one of the things that we kind of get caught up with when we talk about thoughtful travel, responsible travel, sustainable travel, choose your terminology, is we get kind of caught up in the actions. Are we not using our single-use plastics? Are we using train over flying short distances? And certainly all of these things tie into being a thoughtful traveler. But I think we really need to be more aware of ourself, like the self as in the physical person and our actions and what it means to be in this specific place and time. Because we as people and beings on this planet have an impact just simply based on existing and being. And that impact can be positive or negative. But we need to realize that our presence has some sort of impact on the environment, on the culture that we're integrated with at the moment, on the people who are around us and that we're interacting with. We are not moving through the world without having some sort of impact on it in some way. And as we walk with our story and our history with us, we become part of the story in the world around us. And so I think thoughtful travel really means being aware of ourselves and how that has a ripple effect on the environment around us. And travel has this kind of connotation, if you will, as a way for people to escape our daily lives and the stresses and struggles that we might be having. But when we hold on to this idea that we're escaping our place in our day-to-day lives, we're still taking ourselves somewhere else. This really manifests and shows through the actions that we have. So certainly, being a thoughtful traveler does mean saying no to plastic straws, but it also is shown through our expectations that we have. what are we going to do and how are we going to act? So being a thoughtful traveler also means thinking about, for example, how we are going to interact with people. Are we going to bargain? Why? How are we going to go about the act of bargaining? And then what does that have to do with the way that the local people respond to us? And how do we respond in kind? When we use water in a place, somebody else cannot use that water. When we bargain with somebody in the marketplace, we are asking them to make decisions about how they live and how they're going to interact with us, right? I think the other thing that's really important to think about when we talk about thoughtful travel is what are our expectations in regard to what we have already perceived to be a travel experience. And so we see this, for example, when we talk about cultural travel and community-based travel, and a lot of the imagery that we see around these kinds of concepts is that you will go to a place and you will interact with people who will share their local traditions and wear their traditional costumery for you. Does that mean then that you expect them to do something out of the norm of how they might normally act or interact with people in their cultural traditions in space, right? So there are further ripple effects of all of these actions and expectations and belief systems that come into play when we travel. And, this can result in, for example, destinations kind of shaping themselves around the travel experience. And then we create a condition where travel is shaping a destination versus people actually experiencing a place for what it is, even if it doesn't meet their expectations, right? So thoughtful travelers always thinking about this and how their presence in a place has an ongoing ripple effect to the environment and the people beyond them. And I would say being a mindful and thoughtful traveler really requires going beyond where to why and how. We need to think more than where I'm going for my next trip and really be asking ourselves, why am I going there? How am I going there? What am I expecting?
That's a great angle on it. And I think certainly it's 15, 20 years ago, I didn't travel thinking that way. I just traveled because I wanted to see new places, and it was very, me. And I hope that over the last few years, I've been much more thoughtful about exactly that, about what impact I have and what the ripple effect is. I think that's a really good way to put it. Before we go on, I just want to pick up on JoAnna's mention of travel being a means of escape. I think that's a common reason for taking a trip, this idea of escaping from everyday life, escaping from routine, and there's definitely nothing wrong with that. But I think the downside of thinking of it as escape, as JoAnna suggested, is that means we can travel in a bit of a self-centered way, thinking kind of only about our own well-being because we want or deserve perhaps an escape. But the thing is that I think being more thoughtful doesn't mean we don't get to have that feeling of escaping from everyday life. I think that being more thoughtful and finding ways to make your trip more meaningful, it's actually like an extra level of escape, because you can really focus on something that's really not your everyday life. So I think, this whole escape idea is a bit of something we need to ponder. Anyway, back to our interview. We actually started talking about the pandemic, because who doesn't these days? And I asked JoAnna whether the pandemic and post-pandemic travel, in fact, might be kind of helping us to be more thoughtful travellers. Basically, has COVID-19 disrupted the tourism industry enough to lead to some, useful and lasting change?
That's a great question, because over the last year and few months, I have seen a lot of the folks in the tourism industry who are working in the tourism industry really, they have stated their desire to recognize and realize a new way of delivering on the travel experience. And I have seen this in some capacities. You see companies that have decided to cut back on some of their flying holidays, and they're like only going toward rail holidays, for example. We're seeing more companies who are offering like carbon labels on their trips. There have been some great partnerships with like rewilding organizations. And so I do see promise and new ways of thinking about the travel experience. I don't think it's radically disrupted the way that it needs to be disrupted, though, right, because I am really concerned with the way that we are coming back to travel. Mm-hmm. To me, again, I'm living in a destination that doesn't have vaccine rollout in any sort of meaningful fashion, and I see the tourism narrative being, travelers, we need you for our industry to survive. Please get, you are invited here. And yet, is that the right thing for local community? I'm hearing a lot of the industry bodies say, travelers, we need you to survive. What I think radical disruption would look like would be for, these big top-down organizations to say, you know what, right now is maybe not the right time, but what we're willing to do is put our voice and our power and our money and our efforts toward getting vaccines rolled out to everybody across the world. And then we can begin to promote tourism again. So we're continuing on this same narrative that we need travel right now in order for tourism to survive. But I believe that if travel and the tourism industry really is a partner in a better and more regenerative world and more sustainable world, then it's not about travel. Mm-hmm. It's about doing the right thing for humanity. I unfortunately don't think we've seen the radical disruption that we had the opportunity to see. Yeah. I think we've taken some small steps. I would have liked to see us as an industry do something even more.
So let me interject briefly again. I just wanted to mention that in the month or so since JoAnna and I recorded this episode or this interview, we've seen travel return even more in some parts of the world, especially North America and parts of Europe, with higher rates of vaccination, and summer in the Northern Hemisphere. But one worrying thing I've seen is the increased cost of travel. I've seen friends traveling in Europe, and they have to have €100 COVID tests ahead of each flight, which adds up fast, especially if you have a couple of kids. And while I think that extra cost will certainly help us be a bit more thoughtful about how we travel, and probably travel more slowly for longer rather than just 2 days away if it's going to cost, €200 for testing. But it also makes it much harder for those on a budget. And, I fear it'll be something that becomes more focused on people of privilege. And of course, here in Australia, we still have closed international borders, and recently, thanks to some new outbreaks, closed state borders too. So it's hard to know what travel will look like here post-pandemic. We'll have to wait and see. Okay, so my next question is, I know that you work with a lot of the kind of important themes that we deal with a lot here on the podcast, but at a very advanced and extra thoughtful level. I know I was saying to you before, I'm often very encouraged to think more deeply about an issue when I read your work, so thank you for that. Now, sustainability is an important one, but sustainability can be quite a broad term. So I wanted to hear more about, what do you think are the most important themes of sustainable tourism?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And I think one of the things that's really important to think about is this term sustainability, because, even we already talked about this idea that we have responsible travel and thoughtful travel and sustainable travel. And of course, now you hear probably a lot this idea of regenerative travel. And I think it's really important for us to not get caught up in the terminology and not get so bungled in all the words that we really lose sight of what we're trying to achieve when we talk about building a more sustainable model, not just in tourism, but in the world in general. And so when we talk about regeneration, I think it's worth, spending a quick moment on what we mean by that, because you do see a lot of people and companies kind of jumping on the regeneration bandwagon, and they're saying, oh, sustainable tourism was yesterday's news, and now we're all into regenerative tourism. And so with the tourism lens, what we're talking about when we say regeneration is that we mean to say that the act and presence of travel has a positive impact. And in contrast, sustainable tourism is supposed to be this idea that tourism leaves a destination in a constant state, causing no additional damage. So when we talk about regenerative tourism, we're saying not only have we caused no damage, but we're also, having a positive impact.
Doing good as well.
Doing good as well. So there's been this backlash against sustainability, and there are debates on this versus that. As if the two are in competition or not aligned with each other. And, you're either team sustainability or team regeneration. And it seems to me that this idea of regeneration has really put those that are working in tourism in this idea that they need to be creating products or services that fit nicely in the regeneration box.
Interesting. Yeah.
And it is my belief that sustainability should be with intention by default. And we shouldn't have sustainable travel. We shouldn't have responsible travel. The way we travel just simply should be responsible and sustainable. And that is, honestly, that is on the tourism industry to develop products and services and experiences that do not cause damage, so that when travelers make decisions, they have no choice but to be responsible and respectful and thoughtful by default.
Yeah.
And when we in the travel community or as travelers support communities as they are, then that is when the tourism industry is regenerative. That is when we do leave a community better than it was before we arrived, because our physical presence, our financial support adds value to the community. We are not trying to create something new. We are supporting what is.
Absolutely. And I know from my experiences, those kind of experiences when we travel are by far the most impactful and interesting for us personally as well. They're the ones we really learn something from.
Absolutely.
To me, a lot of those experiences have been when I've had the good fortune to be like an expat living somewhere for a longer time. But, it's absolutely not impossible to also do that while you're traveling, for a shorter trip as well. And I think it's just a matter of kind of putting that mindset into place before you go. We talk a lot on the Thoughtful Travel podcast about getting to know local people, because, that's, one of those most beneficial and most interesting parts of traveling. And also, benefiting local people appropriately when we travel, but it's always tricky to know. And I read a post on your site about what do we mean when we say local. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this idea of local. You had asked earlier, what are some of the things that I saw over this past year, and whether I thought that the industry was actually disrupting its old models in any way. And one thing I would say is, we're absolutely moving away from the mass tourism model. We have been for a long time, but it's really moved toward this locally focused tourism, if you will, or community focused tourism. And this is really great in theory. I mean, by all means, this is a much better direction to be going in. But like anything, I think we need to really be asking, what does that mean? We love to latch onto a word and call it a day, but there is nuance in terminology and in practice. So in this article that you referenced, one of the main issues is defining who or what is local, because it can mean a lot of different things. When we talk about the local culture, are we talking about the indigenous culture that has maybe not been recognized for many generations? Are we talking about residents? You mentioned expatriates and living somewhere for a longer period of time. I am an expatriate, but am I local? And so it matters, right? When we talk about interacting with the local people and supporting the local economy, we need to think about what that means. Because at the height of mass tourism, up to 75% of tourism income in some destinations was victim to leakage,
wow.
which meant that profits were going back into the pockets of transnational companies, and they weren't staying in a destination. So now when we're talking about supporting local, that's great. We want money to be staying in a local community, but who specifically is benefiting when we, support local? Because if we only have, say, a couple expatriates who have set up a couple, hotels, and that's where everybody is staying, and that money is staying in their pockets, and it's not actually trickling down to anybody, okay, it's staying local, but to what means? Who's actually benefiting from this? So I think, we need to keep having these hard conversations, and we need to keep peeling back the layers, because I think one of the things that we're going to see in this next wave of tourism trends is the possibility of local washing.
Yes, I was just thinking exactly that. Yeah.
Because again, we as thoughtful travelers, we want to do the right thing. We want to support local. And so we're going to see tour operators and destinations and accommodations and other service providers say, we support the local economy, or we support the local people. And we need to have accountability in the destination. Travelers need to ask what that means. They need to not be scared to find out who actually is being supported through the experiences I'm having or through the interactions I'm having. Transparency and accountability will be imperative as we move into this next phase of locally focused experiences in the travel space. So, my point in writing this article is not to call into question whether we should be supporting local communities, because I'm all for that. But I really think, just like anything, there's nuance and complexity, and it is not as easy as just slapping a label on something and saying, we support local, and you're just supposed to know what that means. I would just like to, encourage people to ask those questions, keep peeling back the layers.
Do a bit of research.
Do your research. It is absolutely in your right to ask your tour operator, your accommodations, anything like that, for accountability and transparency. You are spending your money, you are spending your time and energy and effort. You should know what it's going toward.
Absolutely. Yeah, completely agree. And I know I've been traveling too many times where I've thought, none of this money is going to where I would like it to go. And there's got to be better ways. And some destinations, that's sometimes very tricky, or certainly years ago it was very tricky. But yeah, I definitely want to pay much more attention to that and make sure that if I think back about recent travel, I've done okay there, but there's always room to do better and to really kind of think that through. So that was gave me a lot of food for thought, that one. So thank you.
Yeah.
Now, the final question I wanted to ask JoAnna is a bit of a special one, because I know there are a lot of other podcasters, bloggers, influencers, travel writers, journalists, etc., content creators in general in the travel space who listen to this podcast. And I knew that JoAnna would have some really useful and important things to say for people like us who work in the industry and are talking about travel all the time. So I asked JoAnna to give us some advice on how we can go about doing this job in the best way.
I just really want to recognize that the work that travel content creators, whether you're a writer, journalist, blogger, videographer, podcaster, whatever your job is, it is a job, and it is hard, and it is work. And I want to acknowledge that, because I know that so many people see travel content creators and just think that you're having a jolly good time, and you are, but I also know that it's a lot of work. And so, first of all, I just want to recognize that, because the other thing that goes alongside that I think is really important as all of us build back better is that travel content creators need to recognize the influence that they have and really take that influence to heart, because travel is not your average product. People are investing a lot of time and effort and energy and money into their travel experiences and making decisions about what they're going to do, where they're going to go, how they're going to interact with their experiences. And that matters. You know, travel is not a shirt that you can return if it doesn't fit right. When somebody travels, they are having an impact, whether positive or negative, on the destination where they go. And so travel content creators very much influence the decisions they make and how they will establish their expectations before they travel, how they will interact with the environment around them while they're in a destination, and the stories they will tell about those experiences when they return home. So it is really important that you recognize the influence that you have. And moving forward, I think that it's essential that travel content creators have closer collaborations with and conversations with their hosts, editors, sponsors. Again, we all need to hold each other accountable. We need to have hard conversations about sustainability issues and the climate crisis. And that involves everything from asking your destination, what is it doing to address, the climate crisis? Can we, being honest and saying, I sure love that swag, but do I really need that swag? And like carrying, that conscious consumer mindset with you when you travel. So I want to see more collaboration and accountability on behalf of not just the host, editors, and sponsors, but the travel content creators as well as we go back into the world. And then in terms of the storytelling process itself, we need to move beyond the beautiful backdrops of our old Instagram days. We absolutely need to be seeking cultural and historical context. We already talked about the importance of finding diverse storytellers and storylines that really bring destinations to life in a way that uncovers those maybe uncomfortable stories that we've avoided talking about in the past. We need to be really mindful again and very aware of the perspective and bias, power and privilege that we carry with us and how that impacts how we tell stories, why we tell certain stories, what we have access to, who we can interview, how that impacts the way that we might communicate with somebody. And we need to be more honest and transparent in our process. And that includes, our creative process, the ethical dilemmas that we're struggling with. We need to be talking about our comped experiences and the reality of the world that we're living in. Again, we can't just escape this day-to-day world and go on a holiday and pretend like there are no challenges, because there are challenges everywhere. All of these things, right? Because at the end of the day, and I think this is really important to remember, what content creators put out in the world, the, couple words that they choose, the photograph that they're going to pair with it, the edited down video or podcast, that is the only thing that your followers or listeners or readers see or hear or experience. And they don't know what you don't tell them. And the decisions they make are based on all of those things that you've been through and that you've thought about. And it's all come down to this. And so we really need to be mindful that our influence as content creators matters.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully
put. And we need to have all of that in mind as we put our content out in the world.
Yeah, I could not agree more. That's brilliant advice. So thank you. So that's really all I had to ask you. It was amazing to chat with you, JoAnna, and thank you so much for giving up some time to have this deep dive into thoughtful travel. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you to everybody who listened today. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you all have safe travels again soon, wherever in the world you might be headed.
So that was my deep dive into thoughtful travel with JoAnna Haugen. Thank you so much, JoAnna, for all your words of wisdom. I know I will continue to learn a lot from you in the future years, and I can't wait to start seeing your experiences in Tunisia too. It's one of my favourite destinations ever and a really fascinating place. So everybody, thank you so much for listening to episode 243 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. You can find out a lot more about what JoAnna's up to, and she often posts really interesting and useful blog posts by going to her website, rootedstorytelling.com. So I'll leave a link for that in the show notes, as well as a link to our Facebook group for thoughtful travellers. And of course, the show notes for this episode will be at notaballerina.com/243. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.